They kept them. And then the red area is when the Court of Oyer and Terminer was in session, and those bars are when the actual seatings of the court took place. The blue part, that's the Superior Court of Judicature, and that was in 1693. Most people don't really even think about that, but they found 3 more people guilty of witchcraft in 1693. They didn't all go home, they just kept processing them until everybody was processed. So this is the basic timeline. If we're going to take a look at, let's say, Samuel Parris, he was very present in all those things in Salem Village. He was the one taking down all these examinations, doing his shorthand and reconstituting it, and we only see his stuff dated in that period. There are a couple of other times when he came and swore to the truth of the documents, but that's really, he was only involved until the courts were set up. You would think he'd be more involved, but he disappears. He literally, his handwriting disappears from these documents right as the court is starting to be seated. And that gives us a, I have a different impression of him at that point. A lot of people want to make him out to be the bad guy. I don't think he's the bad guy. I think he was a naive. I think he was narcissistic. I thought he felt personally attacked by the devil because it started in his home. But he left. He wasn't involved anymore. Also, we find a very interesting thing with his handwriting. His handwriting really only appears on depositions against a certain set of people. But curiously, that's his at the top. That's one for Abigail Williams, his niece. They're both for the same set of people. And one of the cool things about one of them, who's going here, this is very early on, but it says the testimony of Abigail Williams, blah, 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 blah. And see some things that are crossed out. Well, with our magnifying glasses, we pulled that off. The testimony of Elizabeth Parris Jr. and. This is the only evidence we've got of little Betty Parris doing anything, and it's crossed out. And the other things is, it says, so it would be plural, Betty and Abigail testify, you can see the Y, but very likely you can see he's changed it to a TH. Abigail Williams testifieth, and saith. And this was there, it's changed to her. All these little teeny tiny things, they basically had wiped Betty Parris out of being a witness. And we can see this because we were looking at this, and all the other transcriptions of this document, they skip right over all the stuff that's been crossed out. And they may have Abigail Williams testify, they might not have had that correction for the TH. But it was really interesting because this is where Betty Parris disappears from the record. Parris did all these different ones. Martha Corey, here's his, here's Abigail Williams. Rebecca Nurse, this is his, and that's Abigail Williams. One of the things to notice at the top, see those little dashes? One of the things that Parris would do is he'd find 2 other people to also go in on his deposition, because you need at least 2 humane witnesses to convict somebody, so he'd do that. But he just had all of these different pairs. Here's one against Elizabeth Proctor, Abigail Williams. John Proctor, here's his, Abigail Williams. Susanna Martin, his, Abigail Williams. And that's the only way we see his handwriting in depositions. So he's constantly pairing them both together. And he's got Abigail Williams saying her thing, and then he's got 2 to 3 adult male witnesses also saying the same thing. So that's where we see the pattern of his participation beyond just doing the examinations. One other thing we can tell from doing the handwriting and the timing is, we'll go to this one again, Court of Oyer and Terminer, Superior Court. We know that Thomas Newton was the first prosecutor, and then at a certain point, Anthony Checkley came over. So we found Thomas Newton, and we found Anthony Checkley, so we have documents, we know what their handwriting looks like. Absolutely, we know what their handwriting looks like. So we're expecting that we'll see a change from Thomas Newton to Anthony Checkley. So here they are, sure enough, here Rebecca Nurse on the left, June 3rd, Abigail Hobbs on September 10th. But surprise, surprise, there are indictments that have neither of their handwriting on. This is Elizabeth Howe from June 29th. It's like, really? Who else was doing this? So let's take a look. Here we go. Thomas Newton. We'll go in here. Thomas Newton. We only see his stuff on what happened in that very first seating of the court. Anthony Checkley, we see them down there, and there's a split in August. So who's writing those? It's Stephen Sewell, the clerk of the court. He wasn't the actual Crown's attorney doing it, but there he is doing the work of the Crown's attorney. And it looks like sort of a transition getting to Checkley. Checkley came in on July 27th. He should have been doing all those ones in August. But Stephen Sewell, brother of the magistrate Samuel Sewell, was doing this. Now, I don't have an explanation for why this happened or what the implications were. I don't. But that's something that was revealed, and only revealed because we could date things and we could identify handwriting. I'd love to have somebody write something about this. Why is this happening? What implications did it have that Stephen Sewell was actually doing the prosecuting of those cases? I leave it to you to think about it and see if you can come up with this. I'm just telling you what we were finding, and that's what the book is about, is to uncover details and make everything clear. And I'm hoping more things can come out of the work we've done. So thank you very much. I didn't go much over an hour. Anyway, I'd love to have questions if you've got any. Yes?
How did you end up having all the people from Europe? How did they become part of this research on, particularly with the...
Excellent question, and it sounds kind of weird that we have people from Finland and Sweden doing this work. However, there aren't too many paleographers in the United States, because that's what it's called, reading old handwriting. And Bernie Rosenthal had written his book, and he'd taken a Fulbright to go to Finland. And he was having a good time, but he was giving some talks about the Salem story. And he was telling about the errors and that problem. And one of the people that came to hear him was Risto Hiltunen from the University of Turku. And Bernie said, well, I don't even know where I can find people who could do this. And Risto said, I know where they are. They're over in Helsinki. Because Matti Rissanen, who's a full professor there, had been working on the history of the English language. And the people that had been working with him had written a whole corpus. In linguistics, you take piles and piles of language and then process it to look for patterns and things like that. Corpus linguistics. If you want more painful detail, I'm happy to tell you later, but that's basically it. So these are people who are used to reading old handwriting. I mean, older than this, but he said, so sure enough, Matti Rissanen was interested, and his students, Mirja Kito and Lena, that sure, they're in on it. And in the meantime, Mirja had gone to Sweden, so one of her students, Peter, was in on it. So we ended up with 6 of these linguists who are experts in historical linguistics and specifically study the history of the English language. I don't think we could have found any Americans to do it. So it was really nice that we could bring them in. I got to be very good at it too, but they were a little close. They had a specific way of doing it. They were methodical. I suppose every single one of these transcriptions was looked at by probably, let's see, all 6 of them, me, Bernie. So there are at least 8 pairs of eyeballs looking at every single transcription in there, and sometimes more than once, and still finding problems. So we did as best we could, but they were methodical and had a lot of experience. So we were very grateful to have them on board. But the European system in higher education is also a lot more flexible for letting people do their stuff than I think it is here. As I said, Peter wrote a paper on the corrections in the documents and comparing the 2 things. And Mirja is the one who was telling Peter about that, whether a certain letter was superscript or not. They seem to have a little more flexibility to indulge their minute obsessions. Mirja has published a paper on the punctuation from just one particular writer in Boston between 16-something or other and the punctuation, a whole published paper. So this is the kind of people we had, and we were very grateful to have them. But you're not going to find that here. I just don't think you will. So, I get it asked a lot, and I go, oh yeah, I forgot about them. Yes, question?
The guy who, Harris or Parrish, I'm sorry, who was in all the documents just for his niece Abigail.
Yep.
Was she a landowner? Did he want, like,
She-
why was he so focused on that? What, if she was a land, who ended up with her
Well,
stuff?
no, Abigail Williams was 11, 10? She was 10. And we still don't even know genealogically if she was his niece. We can't find any evidence that she was his niece as we know niece, like daughter of sibling, daughter of wife's sibling. We can't find anything. We don't know. Various times he calls her kinfolk, and the niece was probably more that there was some kind of lateral thing and a generational difference. We don't know where she came from. We don't know where she went.
Why do you think he focused on her
Because
exclusively?
Because she was afflicted, and that meant that the devil was going after her, and in his house, he was the minister. And to have the devil focusing on his household was an affront to him as a minister and as a good Christian and Puritan. So if she was afflicted, it was really focused at him.
I'm confused. I thought she was accused that she was a
Oh.
victim.
No,
Okay.
she was one of the supposed victims, and a very convincing one. From reading her first symptoms versus how she ended up being at the end, claiming, oh, I can see the specters, the descriptions from Deodat Lawson from early in April are very unusual. They aren't the same kinds of things. Apparently, when a whole bunch of people were around, she was running around the room going whoosh, whoosh, and trying to get under chairs and try and dig under chairs. And she went into into the fireplace and tried to climb up the chimney. And she was throwing burning brands out into the room. And I look at that and say, in PTSD, people have some kind of spark and they kick back to what their reaction was during the traumatic thing. And frankly, that sounds like she was in a house that was under attack. And she could well have been somebody who was a refugee from the frontier in Maine. And if their home had been attacked by the Indians, that could be things that she was doing. Whish, whish, and thinking arrows, digging under a chair, trying to dig away, trying to get up the chimney, throwing things. So it could well be that her first symptoms were post-traumatic stress, but we don't know where she came from. That's the best clue. After that, she sort of fell into this thing where, oh yes, the specters are afflicting me. But it was very different at the beginning. So, anyway, yes?
You showed a slide with the original document and then a page from the book. And for the date, it said 1691/2.
Where did I get it? It's up here, isn't it, somewhere? No,
Before
maybe.
that.
Now you're seeing the meat of the thing. Let's see.
Yeah, it's coming.
Oh, wait.
Yeah,
There we go. Yay.
So 1691/2.
Okay, this is
Oh, yeah.
two different ways of having the calendar.
That's what I thought.
We have January 1st as the new year. They didn't. It was in March. So there were two versions of the calendar, and between January 1st and March, 23rd, somewhere in there. Depends on which calendar you were going by. So
Okay.
in order to sort of make sure people know exactly which year, they do the 1, 2. So it would be the end of 1691, the beginning of 1692. So they didn't want any problem in understanding exactly when the date was. And that's why you have that 1, 2.
And that comes into play when you're looking
Oh,
at
so
birth
it was
dates around that.
Exactly.
time.
Exactly. When I first started doing genealogy, I said, didn't
Yeah.
they know what year it was?
Right.
It took me a while to find out that's what it was.
What was the other calendar based on?
It started in March, and actually, if you think about it, this is October, that's 8, but this is the 10th month. If you think September, that's 7th, October, 8, November, 9, December, 10. So it was an older calendar that started at a different point in the year. And we've gone to the one that started January 1st now, but that's sort of the as a linguist, I go, yes, isn't that cool? You can know what month it was just by what names we've given them. So, and that's the only leftover vestige of it, yes?
So were literate people using that split format and illiterate people
Illiterate people weren't
using one
writing.
or the other?
Illiterate people weren't writing.
Yeah.
So,
But
this-
they might have said, they might have,
I don't know, when you find out how old people were, they usually say, well, about 17, he was about 60 years old. It wasn't, that precision really wasn't as important in the day-to-day lives of farmers. But when you're getting into legal documents and you really want to be specific about things, that's when the literate people would do it. And they also just did not want a mistake to be made. So, yep, again, follow.
another question, the private documents that have come up for auction and such,
They're in private hands, yep.
have those been included? in
Oh,
the
yes, we got everything. We got everything we could find. And as a matter of fact, we contacted the William Reese Company, and that was the bookseller and rare book dealer who was selling the 2 Margaret Scott ones fairly early on. So we saw them along, that we got facsimiles of those. There was one that was in a collection of a private collector in Santa Barbara, and that has since been sold. I got an email from somebody saying, I now own this. Okay, could you please change it at the University of Virginia website? I said, you need to talk to Ben Ray, not me. So every once in a while they do change hands, and there's a finite set of them. Interesting story about Bernie Rosenthal going to see the one in Santa Barbara at the Karpolis archive. He made all sorts of advanced things so he could go, and this is a Santa Barbara mansion. And he had to get to the gate, get buzzed in. And this guy finally let him actually see it to examine it, because Bernie thought, well, it could be a forgery, who knows, I want to see it. So he made these arrangements and he's looking at it, and before he gets to look at it though, the guy points to a fellow in literally a black suit who had a folder and brought it to him. And so he's looking it over before he's going to let Bernie see this document. It was a 7-page dossier on who Bernie was. To make sure he was legit and things like that. So, okay, so Bernie's legit. He lets him see the document, and Bernie's looking at it, and he's thinking, yes, it is a real document. So he turns to this man and said, so now, how did you get this? Remember, 7-page dossier. I forget. So provenance on some of these things that are in private hands. I think he also really didn't want to lose it, because technically it's a public document. They shouldn't be in private hands.
Right.
I mean, the sheriff of Essex County could technically go and seize these things. Wouldn't that be fun? So that, they're interesting, they pop up. So, yeah, okay. Keep going.
The actual court documents, the actual transcript of the trials,
Yeah.
was there such a thing, and
Okay.
is that what's missing?
There are no such things as transcripts of the trials. Every court had a record book, and the record books are pretty bare bones. We do not have the record book for the Court of Oyer and Terminer. We do for the Superior Court of Judicature. And basically in the Superior Court of Judicature, it listed who was on the grand jury, who was on the jury of trials, and quite often just copied what was in the indictments and then gave the verdict. That was basically what was there. Oh, you also knew from the seating of the court, it would say which judges were seated on that session. That's the information you've got.
And you know which of the supporting documents were used?
No, only by looking at those supporting documents to see if they have a notation on them. But the court record book didn't have that stuff. It would be nice to have that one, and everybody makes a big deal, oh, we don't have the record book for the Court of Oyer and Terminer. Oh. And it's really interesting when people try and figure out why we don't have one. And sometimes they say, well, maybe they didn't keep one. And I say, no, they always wrote everything down. Every other dinky little court everywhere has a record book. Well, maybe they were too embarrassed and they got rid of it. And I'm going, no, because we have something in the case of Abigail Faulkner Sr. from here in Andover. When she was applying to get the attainder removed from the conviction and to get compensated, she went out and had real copies, vera copia, made of the evidence against her, and she has a little piece that looks like it was taken directly out of a record book. My my estimation is that a lot of people in the aftermath, when they were trying to get the attainder removed from their names, from their convictions and trying to get compensation, probably went and said, I need to get something copied out of that. I think probably the thing fell apart. It may have gone to different towns to be used and just disintegrated from use afterwards when they were trying to overturn all of these convictions and compensate people. So it wouldn't have told us a whole lot, but I think it just got, the reason we don't have it is for disuse. There was an article in the paper in the 1990s that said that they had found a 17th century court record book in the Suffolk County Courthouse. It had fallen behind a filing cabinet. And I'm going, Oyer Interpreter, Oyer Interpreter, Oyer Interpreter. No, it was the record book for the Superior Court of Judicature. It had been transcribed in the late 19th century, so we knew what was there, but it had fallen behind a filing cabinet. It is now in the Judicial Archives, and Libby Bouvier is very particular. Nobody gets near it. And I don't blame her on that one, so.
I got it.
Sure.
You just mentioned compensation.
Yep.
What did they give people who they said, forget about it?
Nobody ever really said forget about it. Everybody held on to this. If you were convicted, only if you were convicted. A lot of people put in and said it cost me this. I had to pay this much to be fed. I had to pay different things. The only people who were compensated, and it was about 20 years later, were people who were actually convicted. And of course, a lot of those were dead. So the families had to put in something and how much they had to pay. And quite often it was how much they had to pay the court clerk to copy the record. So we know that the court clerk was copying all sorts of stuff for them. So they were putting in for a few pounds compensation for their losses. We do see other people putting in things for lots of money, and usually those are the people like Samuel Wardwell. Once he was convicted, the sheriff could come in and seize the goods and chattels. It wasn't about land, but it was about all the stuff in your house, and all the stuff in your barn, and all the stuff growing in your fields, and those could be seized for the crown. The most elaborate one of that was Philip English in Salem town, who was a merchant, and they seized everything in his warehouse. So when he was asking for compensation, it's a really long list of all these really cool things. We had to look them up. There were all these different specific kinds of fabric. I give Matti Pekkola real credit for just going through every single thing to find out, well, what is this one? What is that one? You know, we don't think about fabric in the way they did, but they were importing it from England and different things. It was valuable. But it took, I think, 50 years to figure that out because they kept saying, we want this money back. The Wardwells, I think, got 36 pounds. And that was for all of their livestock, the hay, the corn, the carpentry tools, and they got 36 pounds back. But the most poignant one is the Good family. Sarah Good's husband, William Good, just said, this is what I've lost. My wife, the infant that she was breastfeeding at the time, the infant died before the mother was hanged, and also little Dorothy Good, the daughter, was just forever traumatized for having been chained in the dungeon for 6 or 7 months. And that just totally destroyed her. So how do you get compensation for that? Basically, the court said, how about 30 pounds? And then they gave him 30 pounds. But I mean, it didn't sound like he was asking for money. He wanted, you know, I lost my family over this. So those are the kinds of things. You only saw men's accounts for this kind of seizure, although Dorcas Hoare was a widow. So there's an account from her, yeah, she survived, but it's really interesting to see these things. There's only the people who were convicted that got compensated. Even the people who were in jail for all this time and then found not guilty, whoops, you just had to, and you had to pay your jailer's fees to get out, so, yeah. Questions? Yeah?
You've created this beautiful database with all sorts of samples and things. What happens to it?
It's just sitting on one of my servers. Every once in a while I go, oh, they changed PHP again? Oh, so there's all sorts of stuff. Oh, good. Yes, very much so. Everything's backed up. But every once in a while the technology changes, although the raw data is intact. But a lot of stuff that we did, basically it was just to produce this book.
Okay.
So if somebody asks me a question, somebody says, well, can you tell me about this and stuff? I can go in and look at the raw data in the database and can come up with all sorts of things. As a matter of fact, if you look at the book, it's 978 documents. So there are 978 holes with a single query from the database that I designed. It basically made this net. And if you take that book and take out all the transcriptions, with a single query, I created the whole net. Everything was put in chronological order, cross-referenced, all the notes, everything, all the names of the people. I was very proud of myself with that database query, since I didn't know about databases and queries at the very beginning. But it just created this one perfect Word document, and then we had 978 Word documents that just were linked into those holes, so if somebody made a change in one, it just updated the master document, and I felt like it was fragile the whole time. That I backed up. Oh, I had a hard drive backup, and then I backed up into the cloud, because I was terrified that my house would burn down, and all that work would be gone. So, and I was the pivot point for everybody. So every time people sent me stuff, I was going, okay, I can't lose this. So the database saved me a lot of work, but it also really helped in the end to put together the book. And then also, in the essays in the front matter, they would reference these things. And I said those ECCA, the ECA numbers, they had references to those, but we wanted to have it reference the number we called the document, so I had to have special mail merges set up. It was just, because we changed the order sometimes, and we couldn't just say, oh, let's put this as number 123, after Bernie and I had gone through things once and twice, it might end up being number 80. So I used mail merge to make sure that the front matter actually had the right references to them. It was a lot of fun. I learned a whole lot. I learned a whole lot of great respect for Microsoft Word, for things that you will never ever use Word for. It's a very powerful thing, but anyway, those are the kinds. It is sitting out there. If people have a question, I can sometimes retrieve stuff from the database that I put together.